In Philip K. Dick's novel Ubik, as with a number of his other novels, there are multiple, let's call them antagonists, the malevolent or bad characters. And we've got Ray Hollis, who is engineering an ambush, a surprise attack on Runsiter Associates. We have Pat Conley, whose parents work for Hollis, who herself actually thinks that she is one of the baddies and is doing the things to people in Half-Life and in Cold Pack. And then we get the real antagonist much later on, who is Jory. And we're introduced to him very early on in Chapter 2. Glenn Runsiter is at the moratorium conferring with his wife, Ella, who died when she was 20. She has been in Half-Life for 60 years, and he's communicating with her as best as he can, and then her signal winds up being, you could say, repressed, taken over, and he gets a different voice in his ear. My name is Jory. Not Ella's thoughts, a different Elan, more vital and yet clumsier without her deft subtlety. Get off the line, Runsiter said in panic. I was talking to my wife, Ella. Where'd you come from? I am Jory, the thoughts came, and no one talks to me. I'd like to visit with you a while, mister, if that's okay with you. What's your name? Stammering Runsiter said, I want my wife, Miss Ella Runsiter. I paid to talk to her, and that's who I want to talk to, not you. I know, Mrs. Runsiter, the thoughts clanged in his ear, much stronger now. She talks to me, but isn't the same as someone like you talking to me, someone in the world. Mrs. Runsiter is here where we are. It doesn't count because she doesn't know any more than we do. What year is it, mister? Did they send that big ship to Proxima? I'm very interested in that. Maybe you can tell me. And if you want, I can tell Mrs. Runsiter later on, okay? And Runsiter is going to go complain to Herbert von Vogelsang about, what sort of place are you running here? And he's going to find out from this director that he says, that would be Jory Miller. I believe he's located next to your wife in the bin. After prolonged proximity, there is occasionally a mutual osmosis, a suffusion between the mentalities of half-lifers. Jory Miller's cephalic activity is particularly good. Your wife's is not. That makes for an unfortunate one-way passage of proto-phasons. And von Vogelsang says, to Jory, phase out, Jory, that's a good boy. Jory passed, he's saying this to Runsiter, at 15. That's why he has so much vitality. Actually, this has happened before. Jory has shown up several times where he shouldn't be. And he says, this is very unfair of you, Jory. Mr. Runsiter has come a long way to talk to his wife. Don't dim her signal. Jory, that's not nice. And he says, really, there's nothing that Jory can do. Think of 2 AM radio transmitters, one close by, but limited to only 500 watts of operating power, then another far off, but on the same or nearly the same frequency, and utilizing 5,000 watts when night comes, and night, Runsiter says, has come. So they're going to try to isolate Ella, who's starting to wane, and deal with this. And we're going to see this referenced 2 more times, both at the end of a chapter. So the first one is coming when Runsiter is talking with Pat Conley. And he says, I have a 20-year-old wife in Cold Pack, a beautiful woman who, when she gets talked to me, gets pushed out of the way by some weird kid named Jory, and then I'm talking to him, not her, right? So that's not adding too much to the picture. However, in Chapter 14, after Runsiter meets with Joe Chip, we have him going back, now in real life to the moratorium, and we read him thinking about what's actually going on in terms of Jory. So he says, I'd better talk to Ella Am I going to get that damn Jory this time, he asked himself, or will I be able to keep Ella in focus long enough to tell her what Joe said? It's becoming so hard to hang on to her now with Jory growing and expanding and feeding on her and maybe on others over there in Half-Life. The moratorium should do something about him. He's a hazard to everyone here. Why do they let him go on? He thought, maybe because they can't stop him. Maybe there's never been anyone in Half-Life like Jory before. So we've got a Half-Lifer. He's sharing this, we could call it psychic space with others, and he's taking more than his fair share. And this word feeding is quite important. Now, there's something else that's very important as far as the story goes that's happening in Chapter 14. And we read Runsiter saying to Joe Chip, well, you all died, every one of you, and we put you into Half-Life, except for one of your team, Sammy Mundo. He suffered massive brain damage and lapsed into a coma, out of which they say he'll never emerge. And so Joe says, well, wait a second. So he's not in Cold Pack. He's not here. And he says, well, how far is he from us? In Zurich? And he says, yeah, he's at the Carl Jung Hospital, about a quarter mile from this moratorium. And so Joe thinks at first, oh, maybe Sammy Mundo is doing all of this bad stuff in the background. A boy, disorganized and immature, a cruel, unformed, peculiar personality. That may be it. It would fit in with what we're experiencing, the capricious, contradictory happenings. And as it turns out, though, there's no brain activity. So what does this mean? Well, if we're reading the novel and we think about the fact that Sammy Mundo has been there in this shared reality of Half-Life with the rest of the team and, talking, getting lines, we could say, we start rereading these earlier chapters. For example, in chapter 7, we are going to see Sammy Mundo saying some things, right, as part of the team. He's talking about the society being their friend, and that kind of fits with Sammy Mundo's character. But a little bit later, this is in chapter 8, we're going to have Sammy Mundo looking at something and saying, isn't Walt Disney's head supposed to be on the 50-cent piece, right? So he's asking little questions here and there. And then a bit later, we're going to get him talking a little bit more coherently, right? So Sammy Mundo is going to engage with them. And, he says, Mr. Chip, that's a real old automobile. That's what it is, right? How old is it exactly? We're told earlier on that Sammy Mundo is basically as intelligent as a raccoon. So maybe we should have been on guard against this. And we realize Sammy Mundo has been dead. There's no way that he could actually be in the reality they're experiencing in Half-Life. So who is Sammy Mundo? There's another important character too, Don Denny, who also has been talking all of this time. And we're going to find out that Don Denny will actually have been replaced by somebody else, namely Jory. They spray Ubik, and what happens? Well, here's what we read. The person standing there was not Don Denny, an adolescent boy, mawkishly slender, with irregular black button eyes beneath tangled brows. He wore an anachronistic costume, clothes from the middle of the century. On his elongated face, Joe saw a smile, but it was a misshapen smile, a thwarted crease that had become almost a jeering leer. No two features matched, right? Joe thought it was as if the manufacturer of this creature struck it a blow aimed at obliterating it. But the psychical material, the base substance, had been too dense. The boy had not fractured and split apart. He existed in defiance of even the force that had constructed him. He jeered at everything else and it too. "Who are you?" Joe said. The boy's fingers writhed, a twitch protecting him evidently from a stammer. "Sometimes I call myself Matt and sometimes Bill, but mostly I'm Jory. That's my real name." Gray, shabby teeth showed as he spoke and a grubby tongue. Joe asked, "Where's Denny? He never came into this room, did he?" "Dead," he thought, with the others. And now we get a revelation. "I ate Denny a long time ago," the boy Jory said, "right at the beginning, before they came here from New York. First I ate Wendy Wright, Denny came second." So what that means is that every instance of Denny saying or doing things could have been Jory. Also, Sammy Mundo could have been Jory as well. One of them, Jory can't be both of these people at the same time, so one of them has to be a projection, and one was a disguise for Jory. And that puts a whole bunch of things that have been said into somewhat different perspective. For example, just earlier when Jory/Denny is suggesting that, here we go, this really bothers you that her talent no longer works. Pat Conley, right? "There's more. I can tell by your tone of voice, maybe. Anyhow, I know this means something. It's important. It tells you something." What's going on there? Jory is feeling out Joe. A little bit later in chapter 12, Denny is getting some more lines. He reads this message from Runciter. Runciter thinks Pat Conley is lying. You realize that what that would mean? It means she could have nullified all this, everything that's happened to us, starting with Runciter's death, right? And then awareness glittered in his face of an unhappy, stricken kind, right? So this is interesting. And Denny actually says, "Don't say anything to the rest of them, the rest of the team. This may not be true, even if it is, knowing it isn't going to help them." So, this is Jory play acting as Denny at the time. So he's eaten Denny, and he goes on to say, "I did what I do. It's hard to explain, but I've been doing it a long time to lots of half-life people. I eat their life, what remains of it. There's very little in each person, so I need a lot of them. I used to wait until they'd been in half-life a while. Now I have to have them immediately if I'm going to be able to live myself." So it's accelerating. He himself is starting to slide down towards the end of half-life into death. And he is consuming more and more people, including Joe's team, including potentially Ella Runciter, who, as it turns out, won't be consumed by him. And we find out that the doctor is actually, as he's going to say, a product of my mind, like every other fixture in this pseudo-world. So what has Jory been doing? He has been creating the reality, right? The doctor disappears, and Joe says, "What are you going to do when I'm killed off? Will you keep maintaining this 1939 world, this pseudo-world as you call it?" And Jory says, "No, there'd be no reason to." And he doesn't have to maintain too much. Just a hotel in Des Moines, a street outside the window with a few people in cars, maybe a couple other buildings thrown in, stores across the street for you to look at when you happen to see out. And Joe says, "So you're not maintaining Zurich or New York, places that they've been in the novel." And he says, "There's no point. Nobody's there. You're just here in half-life with me, and I'm going to eat you." Right? But it turns out Jory's control isn't complete. He can't keep objects from regressing ultimately to 1939. And he tells him the Ubik keeps you away. This is Joe. And Jory bites his hand trying to eat him, right? A very kind of gross depiction. Gum growl, Jory bubbled, working his jaw sideways like a sheep, grinding Joe's hand until the pain became too much for Joe to stand. He kicked Jory. The teeth released his hand. He crept backward, looking at the blood rising from the punctures made by the troll teeth. Jesus, he said to himself, appalled. You can't do that to me, Joe. Joe said, what you did to them. And he sprays the Ubik on his hand, and he feels better for a little while. But Jory thinks, I'm going to get you sooner or later. And he tells him, don't go too far. Don't go out of town. You won't like that. I can't keep too great an area going. If you were to get in one of the cars and drive for miles, eventually you'd reach a point where it breaks down. You wouldn't like that any better than I do. So what we're going to find is that Joe starts to wind down. He's going to meet with Ella, and Ella is going to give him a lifetime supply of Ubik and say, hey, I want you to be my replacement. Why? Because she can't stand Jory and what he's up to, and she's giving him the Ubik so that he can survive. And there's a suggestion here. Joe says, maybe I can defeat Jory. And she says, do you mean destroy him? He's not invulnerable. Maybe you can do that. I doubt if you can truly do it. In other words, consume him as he does to half-lifers placed near him at the moratorium. And now we get a big, interesting reveal that goes all the way back to Glenn Ronseter saying, what the hell's going on here? What kind of moratorium are they running? Why is Jory allowed to get away with this? Well, we find out. Herbert Schönheit von Vogelsang is paid a great deal of money annually by Jory's family to keep him with the others and think of plausible reasons for doing so. She goes on to say, and there are Jorys in every moratorium. This battle goes on wherever you have half-lifers. It's a verity, a rule of our kind of existence. So Jory is not unique, as Ronseter had been thinking. No, there's Jorys in every moratorium. Somebody preying on the already dead, taking what little life they have to maintain their own life. And she says, it's a battle that has to be fought on our side of the glass by those of us in half-life, those Jory preys on. You'll have to take charge, Mr. Chip, after I'm reborn. Do you think you can do it? It'll be hard. Jory will be sapping your strength always, putting a burden on you. You'll feel as the approach of death, which it is. In half-life, we constantly diminish. Jory only speeds it up. So Joe thinks, well, I can do this guy in. I can remember what he did to Wendy, who he very much cares about. Now, they go to a pharmacy, and the goal there is to get their hands on some spray can Ubik. But Joe realizes that Jory is the pharmacist. He says, you're Jory, I can tell now. He said to himself, I'm learning to know him when I encounter him. You invented this drugstore and everything in it except for the spray cans of Ubik. You have no authority over Ubik. That comes from Ella. But Jory can do something to the Ubik. He says, I've regressed all the Ubik in this store back to the liver and kidney balm. And he's actually a little bit sympathetic. Joe says, I'll use my powers and bring it back into spray can form. And Jory says, go ahead and try. It's not going to work. But we see that Joe doing that actually calls Myra from the Ubik company into their existence, and she brings a can. So we're left with this ongoing conflict, which was being carried on between Ella Ronseter and Jory. Now is going to be Joe versus Jory. Neither of them have won, and perhaps neither of them can win, but this will be what's happening with Jory as the primary malevolent force behind the death of everybody else that we've seen in this novel in their half-life existence.